This woman, Margaret Garner, in fact escaped from Kentucky in 1855 and got to Cincinnati with her 4 children, lived with her mother-in-law, who was a preacher, and was caught by some slave catchers. And when she saw them, she ran out and to the shed behind her house and succeeded in killing 1, but tried to kill all 4. She hit the boys in the head with a shovel, cut one of the girls' throat, and was about to slam that 3rd child up against the wall. She was much made of by abolitionists at that time who said, you see how terrible it is. Because when she was interviewed, she's a young woman in her 20s. And the pictures of her, she's so serene. She was not crazy. She was not foaming at the mouth. She simply said, they cannot live like that. I will not permit them to live the way I have lived. Well, for me, it was the ultimate gesture of the loving mother. It was also the outrageous claim of a slave. The last thing a slave woman owns is her children. And as an expression of affection, it is extreme. But on the other hand, when you think about the way in which mothers and fathers relate to their children, it's very much like that. You say to a child, you, of all things, cannot be dirtied, cannot be sullied. They can do it to me, but not to my children. Because that is the best part of you. That's the immortality. That's the best thing you've ever done. So you move that whole constellation of emotions forward into this desperate circumstance, and you say, I prefer that to kill my children is preferable to having them die.
6 or 7 Negroes were walking up the road toward the house. 2 boys from the slave catcher's left and some women from his right. He motioned them still with his rifle, and they stood where they were. The nephew came back from peeping inside the house, and after touching his lips for silence, pointed his thumb to say that what they were looking for was round back. The slave catcher dismounted then and joined the others. Schoolteacher and the nephew moved to the left of the house, himself and the sheriff to the right. A crazy old nigger was standing in the wood pile with an axe. You could tell he was crazy right off because he was grunting, making low cat noises like. About 12 yards beyond that nigger was another one, a woman with a flower in her hat. Crazy too, probably, because she too was standing stock still, but fanning her hands as though pushing cobwebs out of her way. Both, however, were staring at the same place, a shed. Nephew walked over to the old nigger boy and took the axe from him. Then all 4 started toward the shed. Inside, 2 boys bled in the sawdust and dirt at the feet of a nigger woman holding a blood-soaked child to her chest with one hand and an infant by the heels in the other. She did not look at them. She simply swung the baby toward the wall planks, missed, and tried to connect a second time. When out of nowhere, in the ticking time the men spent staring at what there was to stare at, the old nigger boy, still mewing, ran through the door behind them and snatched the baby from the arch of its mother's swing.
The history of slavery in the New World was one of appalling, inhuman brutality. After a horrific journey from Africa to America, the slaves were separated from their families, sold to the highest bidder, and put to work where they were permanently at risk of beatings, torture, and lynching. This oppression lasted for hundreds of years and involved millions of Negroes. Toni Morrison decided not to confront this graphic horror head-on, but to use it as the background to the book.
You see, the other slave books focused really heavily on the horror of the institution the physical brutality in a sort of abstract way in which it was a group of lovely people were being forced to do something because they were being brutalized. What I wanted to do was to put the locus, the heart of the story, within the mind of the slaves themselves, and have the white people sort of drift away and be a kind of background as far as characters are concerned, so that what you have is the system itself.
Anybody Baby Suggs knew, let alone loved, who hadn't run off or been hanged, got rented out, loaned out, bought up, brought back, stored up, mortgaged, won, stolen, or seized. So Baby's 8 children had 6 fathers. What she called the nastiness of life was the shock she received upon learning that nobody stopped playing checkers just because the pieces included her children. Hala she was able to keep the longest, 20 years, lifetime. Given to her, no doubt, to make up for hearing that her 2 girls, neither of whom had their dull teeth, were sold and gone, and she had not been able to wave goodbye. To make up for coupling with a straw boss for 4 months in exchange for keeping her 3rd child, a boy, with her, only to have him traded for lumber in the spring of the next year, and to find herself pregnant by the man who promised not to and did. That child she could not love, and the rest she would not.
Love just a little bit. And then you may have a little left over for the next thing that comes along. But for mothers, it's a cliche, the loss of children. But if you can say, every parent knows his children's hands. You'd recognize them in a pile of hands. Or, the small things on the body. But to have children taken before they get their hands, when the hands are still baby hands, what are their teeth like? What are their eyebrows? All those things you touch and hold and remember that makes one child yours. Yeah. They couldn't hang on to those memories.
What could it be, this dark and coming thing? What was left to hurt her now? News of Hala's death? No. She had been prepared for that better than she had for his life. The last of her children, whom she barely glanced at when he was born, because it wasn't worth the trouble to try to learn features you would never see changed into adulthood anyway. 7 times she had done that, held a little foot, examined the fat fingertips with her own, fingers she never saw become the male or female hands a mother would recognize anywhere. She didn't know to this day what their permanent teeth looked like, or how they held their heads when they walked. Did Patty lose her lisp? What color did Famous' skin finally take? Was that a cleft in Johnny's chin, or just a dimple that would disappear as soon as his jawbones changed? 4 girls, and the last time she saw them, there was no hair under their arms.
Was there a sense in which you were drawn to slavery or the post-slavery condition of people in America as part of the start of the book?
No, quite the opposite. I was always frightened, and it would never occur to me to go into that area. I never thought I had the emotional resources to deal with slavery. And as a matter of fact, I thought I was writing a story about, a very contemporary story. I wanted to write about self-murder, the ways in which we can sabotage ourselves with the best of all possible intentions. And the story that occurred to me was the story about this woman, Margaret Garner, who had indeed killed her children. And she was a slave. So I was sort of pulled into slavery by this other idea. But since it was such a classic example of what I wanted to write about, I had to do it. And I thought, well, I never liked books about slavery. They were always so big and so flat, and you could just never get close to them. So I thought if I did something narrow and deep, it would be successful. slavery is, it's like having World War II for 200 years. It's exactly like that. Two things were clear. I had done the same thing that most Afro-Americans have done, and is not remember. Because you can't if you want to get up and go to work the next day. And the other thing was to absorb a little bit, not the totality of it, because it's paralyzing. And that became part of the question in my mind as I began to write this book and do the research on it, which was, there wasn't a great deal of information. Now that may sound surprising because there's a lot of history, and there's songs and there's folklore, but there was something untold, unsaid, that never came down. There was some deliberate, calculated, survivalist intention to forget certain things. There was almost no reference to the ships. There were no songs. I know no songs about it. I know no stories about it. The trauma of that voyage and the deaths that took place on it, they just almost don't exist. One has to go to the white slave ship captains and owners for that information, because frequently when they were about to die, they wrote their life stories, and it was a kind of confession, and they sometimes did it, but almost nothing came down orally to my generation.
There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching too. I am always crouching. The man on my face is dead. His face is not mine. His mouth smells sweet, but his eyes are locked. Some who eat nasty themselves, I do not eat. The men without skin bring us their morning water to drink. We have none. At night, I cannot see the dead man on my face. Daylight comes through the cracks, and I can see his locked eyes. I am not big. Small rats do not wait for us to sleep. Someone is thrashing, but there's no room to do it in. If we had more to drink, we could make tears. We cannot make sweat or morning water, so the men without skin bring us theirs. One time they bring us sweet rocks to suck. We are all trying to leave our bodies behind. The man on my face has done it. It is hard to make yourself die forever. You sleep short and then return. In the beginning, we could vomit. Now we do not. Now we cannot. His teeth are pretty white points. Someone is trembling. I can feel it over here. He is fighting hard to leave his body, which is a small bird trembling. There's no room to tremble, so he's not able to die. My own dead man is pulled away from my face. I miss his pretty white points.
Other things that were forgotten, blocked, hidden, were this collection of sort of tools that remind you of the Inquisition. Over and over again, one can find in, say, the diaries of a Byrd, B-Y-R-D family, a slave family, very prominent family in Virginia. And among his many activities of state, he would say, put the bit on Jenny today. In 1 month, there are 8 references to having put the bit on her. So what I was trying to do was find out, what is that, what do they mean a bit, like a horse? You know, what does it look like? And why isn't anybody feeling explosive about this? The restraining things. There are masks, you know, that they wore when they cut cane, the little holes here, presumably to keep them from eating the cane they cut. But when you you'd breathe in those things, you see. When you take them off, the skin would come right off with them. And there was a really, sort of industrial age invention about some of these things. Hooks, collars, mouthpieces did for me, first of all, it surprised me, even though, as I said, one sort of knew it. But as a writer, it was something that I could sort of attach myself to.
You've talked about this medieval apparatus. You mentioned the bit, like a horse's bit, which you use with tremendous power inside this novel. One of a great number of images, but that one is a very powerful image. What do you feel about using an image like that?
Well, it had three important meanings for me in the text. First of all, there's the thing itself, the physical obscenity of having this instrument in your mouth. And as it turns out, it's not at all like a horse's bit. It's a tongue, a metal tongue that goes in the mouth with a circle around it, like the tongue of a shoe, and you can tighten it and bring it in, and it's sort of lying there in your mouth. And it's certainly painful, but it's also inhuman, because it has the association of what they thought about slaves, which were that they were animals. Third thing is that they stop you from talking. It requires silence, which means that as a human being you do not speak. And it is having no language, not being permitted to articulate anything, not being permitted to express anything, which is the final devastation. It's as though if they could just keep them quiet, just harness them and have them shut up, this labor force would be perfect. And imposing that kind of restraint, little by little by little, atom by atom by atom, should destroy you, physically, spiritually, and all of your human qualities would evaporate. So it had, for me, in essence, what the whole institution was about. These people being required not to be put in a hole or a cell, but to work with this, to cook, to nurse, to change the linen, to plow the fields with these instruments attached to them. It was very successful in a way, but what is always startling is the fact that it wasn't.
He wants to tell me, she thought. He wants me to ask him about what it was like for him, about how offended the tongue is, held down by iron, how the need to spit is so deep you cry for it. She already knew about it, had seen it time after time in the place before Sweet Home. Men, boys, little girls, women. The wildness that shot up into the eye the moment the lips were yanked back. Days after it was taken out, goose fat was rubbed on the corners of the mouth, but nothing to soothe the tongue or take the wildness out of the eye.
I am just repeatedly overwhelmed by the heroism of these ordinary people. When I was a little girl, it was taught to me that slaves in this country managed to be free because there were some very serious, well-meaning white people who thought it was a good thing to do. And it, in addition to the things I'd heard in my family, it never occurred to me that there were these active, organized, serious, life-risking black people who did that all the time. That's what they did. They had several lives, and the principal life was to help escape slaves.
Contrary to what she expected, they poled upriver, far away from the rowboat Amy had found. Just when she thought he was taking her back to Kentucky, he turned the flatbed and crossed the Ohio like a shot. There, he helped her up the steep bank while the boy without a jacket carried the baby who wore it. The man led her to a brush-covered hutch with a beaten floor. "Wait here. Somebody be here directly. Don't move. They'll find you." "Thank you," she said. "I wish I knew your name so I could remember you right." "Name Stamp," he said. "Stamp paid. Watch out for that there baby, you hear?" I hear, she said, but she didn't. Hours later, a woman was right up on her before she heard a thing. A short woman, young, with a crocus sack, greeted her. "Saw the sign a while ago," she said, "but I couldn't get here no quicker." "What sign?" asked Sethe. "Stamp leaves the old sty open when there's a crossing. Knots a white rag on the post if it's a child, too."
Resistance to slavery wasn't only physical. Baby Suggs, the matriarchal character in Beloved, gives a sermon about spiritual survival in the face of all the brutality.
A part of the heritage of black people and uneducated people is oral. And we tend to diminish that knowledge because it's not in print, or it isn't print-oriented. It has something to do also with the distinction made between those who read and those who do not. But the ability to remember is the ability to say it, to repeat it. The instruction that is given via a sermon is really not only instruction, but a narrative form, a metaphor for adjusting oneself to life. What she's saying there, which is quite different from anything you would hear in a formal church, is a very clear picture of how the soul can survive under these circumstances. They don't love it. You have to love it.
Love it. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick 'em out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them. Raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. You got to love it. You. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved. Feet that need to rest and to dance. Backs that need support. Shoulders that need arms. Strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, love it. And the beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize.
Yonder they will not hear anything you say from your mouth, so you have to love it. They will break your neck, so stroke it. And anything you can imagine you can have. There is no grace unless you can imagine it. Now this she has invented But it's not really ad hoc. It would come from that great tradition of sermonizing, which is the great rhetorical passion and the absolute fascination, particularly that Black people have always had for language. It surfaces in our culture in a number of ways. When one listens to the speeches of Martin Luther King or Jesse Jackson or any of those people, people say, well, they're extraordinary speakers and they have this. But that's the way all those people talk in any little storefront church. Because the whole idea of stylizing a message with biblical terms or parables or what have you, in order to get a real response, because that's the other aspect. They do not expect you to listen silently in a sort of Western tradition. You must, something visceral is supposed to happen. You're supposed to tap your feet or say amen or jump up or dance or what have you, but there is this connection between the orator and the listener.
Is there a sense in which you want to idealize these people? Is there a sense in which that is a deliberate act or mythologize them?
I don't. You see, my grandfather was born a slave. He was 5 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation came. As he put it, came, and he didn't know what it was. And as a little boy, he crawled under the bed because he thought something terrible was about to happen. But at any rate, I'm old enough to remember my grandfather and my great-grandmother. And those people were born in slavery. And then just knowing their very ordinary, unheralded lives, it's extraordinary what they did just to get through 60 years of existence. And you take any one of those lives, it seems like a monument. So my job as a writer, first I thought, well, I'll cut them down to size and make them, digestible. I simply couldn't. And so when I have been accused, and a lot of times I have been, of making characters larger than life, I realized that what I had in fact done was simply describe characters who were as large as life. Life is that large. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way. But by 1873, Sethe and her daughter, Denver, were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, that was a signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettleful of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor. Soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult, not to be born or witnessed a second time. Within 2 months, in the dead of winter, leaving their grandmother, Baby Suggs, Sethe, their mother, and their little sister Denver, all by themselves in the gray and white house on Bluestone Road. It didn't have a number then, because Cincinnati didn't stretch that far. In fact, Ohio had been calling itself a state only 70 years, when first one brother, and then the next, stuffed quilt packing into his hat, snatched up his shoes, and crept away from the lively spite the house felt for them.
The idea of a house is extraordinarily powerful in this book, but is powerful in all your writing, as where you want to put the center of your fiction.
Yes, I used to think it was being a woman and always writing about rooms and houses, which I understand is a preoccupation of women writers. But I don't think so. It has something to do with homelessness. Whether one is homeless, where is the culture, where is the history, and what is it, and having one, so that a house becomes a haven, or it can become a haven with threat. And so when I start out with 124, spiteful, It's the character of this house which holds all of the terror and all of the love and all of the problems of the larger world, the slave world that they are in.
And it's largely the domain of women, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Not exclusively, but largely.
Largely, because it's important under slave society that there be no connection. Otherwise, they would have had marriage ceremonies and they would have insisted upon children. But you can't have marriage if you're going to sell the children. You can't have people really having a legal ceremony when they're, slavery reproduced its own product that was also for sale. So the destruction of the family was essential, so that everything was done in order to keep those genders separate and to make sure that those men were not at all feeling responsible for wives and children. They chain danced over the fields, through the woods, to a trail that ended in the astonishing beauty of Feldspar. And there Paul D's hands disobeyed the furious rippling of his blood and paid attention. With a sledgehammer in his hands and high man's lead, the men got through. They sang it out and beat it up, garbling the words so they could not be understood, tricking the words so their syllables yielded up other meanings. They sang the women they knew, the children they had been, the animals they had tamed or seen others tame. They sang of bosses and masters and misses, of mules and dogs, and the shamelessness of life. They sang lovingly of graveyards and sisters long gone, of pork in the woods, meal in the pan, fish on the line, cane, rain, and rocking chairs. And they beat the women for having known them and no more. No more. The children for having been them, but never again. They killed a boss so often and so completely, they had to bring him back to life to pulp him one more time. Tasting hot meal cake among pine trees, they beat it away. Singing love songs to Mr. Death, they smashed his head. More than the rest, they killed the flirt, whom folks called life, for leading them on, making them think the next sunrise would be worth it, that another stroke of time would do it at last. Only when she was dead would they be safe. I wanted my language to be musical, and I know how terrible that must sound, but not to have ornate, poetic words, but in fact to write very simply, which I think I do write very simply, and that the elaborateness, the elaborate or the ornate quality or the rich quality that some people who like my work have called it really comes from simple sentences in which the reader is invited in with his own emotions. Therefore, the experience is rich because the reader has provided so much of what he thinks, of what he takes away, what he or she takes away from the book. So, but if you place the sentences in the proper order and leave a certain amount of space and dust and clean sometimes very old words, you can arrive at a rich effect without having recourse to overwhelming, ornate purple prose. So that I would translate these huge, problematic, emotionally problematic, and intellectually problematic things into smaller but more precise images.
1874, and white folks were still on the loose. Whole towns wiped clean of Negroes. 87 lynchings in 1 year alone in Kentucky. 4 colored schools burned to the ground. Grown men whipped like children, children whipped like adults. Black women raped by the crew. Property taken, necks broken. He smelled skin. Skin and hot blood. The skin was one thing, but human blood cooked in a lynch fire was a whole other thing. The stench stank. Stank up off the pages of the North Star, out of the mouths of witnesses, etched in crooked handwriting and letters delivered by hand. Detailed in documents and petitions full of whereas and presented to any legal body who'd read it, it stank. But none of that had worn out his marrow. None of that. It was the ribbon. Tying his flatbed up to the bank of the Licking River, securing it the best he could, he caught sight of something red on its bottom. Reaching for it, he thought it was a cardinal feather stuck to his boat. He tugged, and what came loose in his hand was a red ribbon knotted around a curl of wet, woolly hair, clinging still to its bit of scalp. He untied the ribbon and put it in his pocket, dropped the curl in the weeds. On the way home, he stopped, short of breath and dizzy. He waited until the spell passed before continuing on his way. A moment later, his breath left him again. This time, he sat down by a fence. Rested, he got to his feet, but before he took a step, he turned and looked back down the road he was traveling and said to its frozen mud and the river beyond, "What are these people? You tell me, Jesus, what are they?"
You know, you're trying to understate in order to let the fire glow, so to speak. You can't use fiery language to describe a fire. You have to use quiet language so that the fire can be seen.
There's also at a stage in the novel, what happens is that it is as if the three women trade, exchange, invest in each other's personalities, because Sethe is talking, and then Denver, her daughter, is talking, and then Beloved, whom she believes to be her daughter given back to her, is talking. And they begin to talk into each other, and the idea of a narrative is gone completely there. These are just little, well, they're not little at all. They're not even digressions. Well, what are they? What do you describe them as?
They are unspeakable thoughts, unspoken, done as soliloquies, the interior language shaped by me, of the things they could not say to one another directly, but certainly everyone understands. They all need each other so much, individually and collectively, that they form this, triad of desperate need to love the other and to have the other love also. So that it becomes, as they each speak their interior thoughts, ultimately I wanted the language to be done in such a way that each sentence, when they are all talking at the same time, is clearly the sentence of one or the other of the two, but they become like a trinity. It's a song that are their desire, song of desire, song of conviction, song of blame, song of explanation, song of accusation, and song of love of all three of these women.
Beloved, you are my sister. You are my daughter. You are my face. You are me. I have found you again. You come back to me. You are my beloved. You are mine. You are mine. You are mine. I have your milk. I have your smile. I will take care of you. You are my face. I am you. Why did you leave me who am you? I will never leave you again. Don't ever leave me again. You will never leave me again. You went in the water. I drank your blood. I brought your milk. You forgot to smile. I loved you. You hurt me. You came back to me. You left me. I waited for you. You are mine. You are mine. You are mine.
You tell the story of Beloved in quite a complex way. Why did you want to make it complex in the telling like this?
I used the way in which one remembers, really as a guiding principle. A little bit here that you don't understand what that means until you get some additional information. A slice there, and you don't know how significant it is. What happens to you on Thursday morning, you may not know how important that little event was for 20 years. We don't know what's monumental as it necessarily happens. We choose the things to forget. So it's the cumulative effect of memory and the cumulative effect of deliberately not remembering. So that I wanted to track, starting with the house and it's the situation of being fraught with something, and to have Sethe maintain a kind of agreeable life, which for the second time falls apart. And all her efforts to forget certain things, because she's remembering by having her house haunted. I mean, it's a way of remembering for her, for all of them, to have that ghost, the baby, the dead baby, haunt the house, to have the dead baby, the murdered baby, come back and say, it's all right, I understand. I really am your sister. I really am your daughter. I really love you.
That child, in a sense, comes back as a real young woman called Beloved. Now, that is a tremendous notion that it is not more nor less than reincarnation in a way, is it? Now, why did you, not why did you, can you just talk about that?
The idea of reincarnation is not alien or foreign. You know, in the Black culture, the notion of a child reappearing in the guise of a cousin or a friend is not at all unusual. The resurgence of spirits and the ability to be possessed by another spirit, to actually exist in other things, human beings as well as non-human things, is not outrageous in the early days of the culture as it survived in this country, and certainly exists in lots of places in Africa, or used to. It has transformed itself in many ways via religion, in some unorthodox but certainly inventive ways in which Christianity is perceived in certain ways, but it's not foreign. So it seemed to me that in this milieu with a slave population, 1853, through the post-Civil War period, 1873, would be very much within the realm of possibility, and not enough. I mean, it was so ordinary, it couldn't even be remarked on. It would be something they would take for granted. So that here you have a mother who hasn't seen her child since she was 1 or 2, and all she would need would be the signs. So she appears, and all the signs are there. The moment she appears, the way she appears, and her hunger. She has enormous hunger for Sethe's company. And her language is the language of someone who has been returned from the other side. She's beautiful, she's mysterious, she's odd, but they need her so much, and obviously her whole life depends on them.
Beloved could not take her eyes off Sethe. Stooping to shake the damper or snapping sticks for kindling, Sethe was licked, tasted, eaten by Beloved's eyes. Like a familiar she hovered, never leaving the room Sethe was in unless required and told to. She rose early in the dark to be there, waiting in the kitchen when Sethe came down to make fast bread before she left for work. In lamplight and over the flames of the cooking stove, their two shadows clashed and crossed on the ceiling like black swords. She was in the window at 2 when Sethe returned, or the doorway, then the porch, its steps, the path, the road, till finally, surrendering to the habit, Beloved began inching down Bluestone Road further and further each day to meet Sethe and walk her back to 124. It was as though every afternoon she doubted anew the older woman's return. Sethe was flattered by Beloved's open, quiet devotion. The same adoration from her daughter, had it been forthcoming, would have annoyed her, made her chill at the thought of having raised a ridiculously dependent child. But the company of this sweet, if peculiar guest pleased her, the way a zealot pleases his teacher.
Another aspect of the novel of Beloved is the way in which the memories or half-memories or re-memories, which is a word you use, of the ancestors of the characters in the book infiltrate the present. They're tapped, they're there, they're spoken to. What values do you think that has for you as a fiction writer?
Well, it's part of my feeling that what is really infinite is the past. And the future always appears to me somehow to be finite. But the past is infinite. And in that sense, there's so much back there to mine from. And part of Black culture has to do with this intimacy between the self and the ancestor. More than simply parental respect. I don't really mean that. I mean the ancestor fulfills a place that no parent can. It's a benevolent, teaching, protective, but not spoiling, not coddling presence that is always accessible.
Did you feel, or do you feel now, looking back on the book, which you've finished a while back, but is about to be published, did you feel that it was a long journey from finding this story of Margaret Garner, who killed one of her 4 children, and then that took you back to the context of slavery, and then you came through that to Beloved, the notion of the returned child. Was that a long journey, going from Margaret Garner to Beloved?
It rocked me in a way that no other work I've ever done has done. I would write one sentence. When I finally got it right, and I would get up and walk up and down the river, trying to get to the next quiet way of saying it. There's so much more to remember and to describe for purposes of exorcism and purposes of rites, celebratory rites of passage. Things must be made. Some fixing ceremony, some memorial, something, some altar, somewhere where these things can be released, thought, and felt. But the consequences of slavery, only artists can deal with. There's certain things that only artists can deal with, and it's our job. Everybody knew what she was called, but nobody anywhere knew her name. Disremembered and unaccounted for, she can't be lost because no one is looking for her. And even if they were, how can they call her if they don't know her name? Although she has claim, she's not claimed. In the place where long grass opens, the girl who waited to be loved and cry shame erupts into her separate parts to make it easy for the chewing laughter to swallow her all away. It was not a story to pass on.